I was married for more than 40 years to a man who kept a secret that stayed locked inside a room I was never allowed to enter, a room I spent 15 years of my life staring at that closed door, wondering what my husband was hiding from me. And when I finally discovered the truth, my dear, I fell to my knees on the floor and cried like I had never cried in my life. But it wasn't from anger, it wasn't from disappointment, it was from a pain so deep I didn't even know it existed. Today I'm going to tell you this story, the story of the fifth room. My name is Grace Ellen Porter. I'm 82 years old. I was born in rural Kentucky, in a small town so tiny it didn't even appear on most maps. I grew up in a simple family, hard-working people who woke before sunrise and went to bed after the stars were already in the sky. My father was a farmer. My mother took care of the house and us 7 children. I was the 4th child, not the oldest to have responsibility, not the youngest to be spoiled. I was in the middle, the one who learned to take care of herself from an early age. But before I continue this story, I want to ask something of you. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please subscribe now. Hit that little button down below, leave a like on this video, because this helps us so much to keep bringing these life stories to you. And tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. What city, what state? I get so happy when I read the comments and see people from all over America following along. So leave it there, okay? Now let's get back to my story. As I was saying, I was born in 1943. Back then, my dear, life was very different from what it is today. Very different indeed. There was no television, no telephone, none of these modern things. We entertained ourselves with what we had. We played in the yard, chased chickens, took baths in the creek, helped mother make soap in the big pot. It was a hard life, but it was a simple life. We didn't know anything different, so we didn't complain. I grew up knowing that my destiny was to marry and take care of a family. That's how it was for every woman back then. We didn't study much. I went through the 3rd grade and then stopped. My father said women didn't need much schooling. We needed to know how to read, write our name, do arithmetic, and that was it. The rest we learned at home. We learned to cook, to sew, to embroider, to take care of children, to be a good wife. That's what mattered. I won't lie to you, I dreamed of marriage. Every girl did. We'd imagine what our husband would be like, what the house would be like, how many children we'd have. It was our princess dream, you know? But it was a different kind of dream. It wasn't about castles and carriages. It was about a simple little house, a hard-working man, a united family. That's what we wanted. And it was in 1960 that I met Theodore. Theodore James Miller. A strong name, wasn't it? Back then, names were like that, substantial. Nowadays, everything is Jake, Matt, Ashley. But back then, parents liked to give these meaningful names, names that came from saints, from important people, from old family traditions. Theodore was a 31-year-old man. I was 17. He was a widower. His first wife had died a few years before, but nobody talked much about it. It was a forbidden subject, you know? People would whisper about it, gossip quietly, but never in front of him. And since I was young and wasn't from the same area as him, I didn't know much about his life before he met me. He came to my town because he'd come to buy some land. Theodore was a man of means. He wasn't truly rich, but he had more than most. He had a good farm, with cattle, with crops, with a big house. And he was looking for a wife, a woman to take care of his house, to give continuity to his life, because he was alone. And a man back then didn't stay alone for long. It wasn't well regarded. We met at a 4th of July celebration. I was with my sisters dancing when he saw me. I remember to this day the way he looked at me. It was a serious, deep look, as if he were studying me. It wasn't the look of a man in love, no. It was the look of someone who was evaluating, someone who was thinking. I found it strange at the time, but didn't pay much attention. He came to talk to my father the next day. He arrived at our house, all dressed up with his hat in his hand, and asked permission to court me. My father was surprised. a man of means, a farm owner, wanting to marry his daughter. It was an honor. It was a chance for a better life for me. My father accepted right away, and so began our courtship. If we can even call it courtship. We saw each other once a week, always with my mother or older sister nearby watching. Theodore was a man of few words. He wasn't one of those who went around making declarations of love, saying pretty things. He was quiet, reserved. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch for half an hour and he'd barely speak. He'd just sit there looking at the horizon, thinking about who knows what. I confess that sometimes I wondered if he really liked me, because he didn't show much, you know? He wasn't affectionate, wasn't one to make sweet gestures, but my mother said that's how men were, that men didn't go around talking about feelings, that what mattered was that he was hardworking, honest, and a good provider, and that Theodore was, no doubt about it. After 6 months of courtship, he asked for my hand in marriage. He came to talk to my father again, this time with a simple gold ring. My father cried with emotion. His daughter was going to marry well, was going to have a good life, was going to live in a big house. It was everything he wanted for me. And so, on June 12, 1962, I married Theodore James Miller. I was 17 years old. He was 33. It was a beautiful winter day with blue skies and bright sunshine. I was wearing a white dress that my mother had sewn with her own hands. It wasn't anything luxurious, but to me it was the most beautiful dress in the world. I felt like a princess. The ceremony was at the little church in the center of town. There weren't many people, just family and some close friends. Afterward, there was a lunch at my parents' house with fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, cornbread, farm food, simple people's food. But it was a beautiful celebration. Everyone was happy. I was happy. When the celebration ended, I said goodbye to my parents. My mother hugged me tight and cried on my shoulder. She told me to be a good wife, to obey my husband, to never give cause for shame. And I promised I would be. I promised I would make him happy. Theodore took me to his farm in an old car, one of those that made a lot of noise and put out a lot of smoke. The trip took almost 2 hours because the road was dirt and full of potholes. I went the whole way in silence, looking out the window, thinking about my new life. I was nervous, I was anxious, I was scared too, I won't lie, because I barely knew this man who was now my husband. When we arrived at the farm, it was already getting dark, and that's when I saw the house for the first time. My dear, I had never seen such a big house. It was an old farmhouse, one of those with a wide porch in front, with wooden shutters, with a clay tile roof. There was a big garden at the entrance, with rose bushes and jasmine plants, and there was a white fence all around, well maintained. Theodore got out of the car and came to open the door for me. He gave me his hand and helped me down. Then he stopped in front of the house, looked at me and said, "This is your house now, Grace. Take good care of it." I entered the house and was amazed. There was a large living room with a velvet sofa. There was a huge kitchen with a wood-burning stove. There was a dining room with a solid wood table. There was a backyard with an orchard and vegetable garden. And there were 5 bedrooms. 5 bedrooms, my dear. I had never lived in a house with more than 2 bedrooms, and now I had 5. Theodore showed me the house slowly. "This here is our bedroom," he said, pointing to the largest one. I looked and saw a double bed with an embroidered bedspread, a dark wood wardrobe, a vanity with a mirror. It was beautiful. It was more than I had dreamed. Then he showed me the other bedrooms. "This one here can be for the children when we have them," he said. I smiled, imagining our children running through that house. "This other one is for guests when your family comes to visit, and this one here is a sewing room if you want." I was counting. There were 4 bedrooms, but the house had 5. I had seen from outside that there was another window, another door in the hallway. "And the last bedroom?" I asked. "What's in there?" Theodore stopped. He was silent for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. His face changed, became more serious, more closed. His eyes darkened and he said in a voice I had never heard before, a hard voice, a voice that didn't accept questioning. That room stays locked. You never need to go in there. I felt a chill down my spine, a cold chill that went from my back down to my feet. I didn't understand why a room would stay locked, what was in there that I couldn't see. But I didn't ask anything. I was a young woman, raised to obey. My mother had taught me that women don't question their husbands. Women accept, women stay quiet, women obey. That's how it worked. That's how it had to be. So I just nodded and said, "Okay." And that's how my marriage began, with a mystery, with a locked door, with a secret that I didn't know what it was, but that I felt was going to change my life forever. That first night, lying in bed next to Theodore, I stayed awake for hours. I heard the crickets singing outside. I heard the wind hitting the windows. I heard my husband's heavy breathing as he slept, and I kept thinking about that room, the fifth room, the forbidden room. What could be in there? Why didn't he want me to go in? What was he hiding? I tried to get it out of my head. I tried to convince myself that it wasn't important, that everyone has their secrets, that I should respect my husband's privacy. But it didn't work. The more I tried to forget, the more I thought about it. In the following days, I began to observe Theodore more closely. I saw that he always put his hand to his pants pocket, as if he were checking something. And I realized it was a key, an old iron key with an ornate handle, the key to the fifth room. He carried this key everywhere. When he went to work in the fields, the key was in his pocket. When he went to sleep, the key stayed under his pillow. When he went to bathe, the key hung on a nail inside the bathroom door. He never, at any moment, left that key away from himself. I began to get more and more curious and more worried, too. What was so important that it needed to stay locked up? What was so secret that not even his wife could know? I tried to ask once. It was about 2 months after the wedding. We were having dinner in silence, as always, when I gathered courage and said, "Theodore, that room in the back, will you ever tell me what's in there?" He dropped his fork on the plate. The sound echoed through the empty kitchen. He looked at me with those dark eyes, those eyes that seemed to hold all the sadness in the world, and said, "I already told you, Grace, that room doesn't exist for you. Don't ask me about it anymore." I felt my heart tighten. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, with so much pain in his voice, with so much weight, as if each word cost a piece of his soul. I didn't ask anymore. Never again. For 15 years I lived in that house, passed through that hallway every day, looked at that locked door, and never brought up the subject again. But the mystery continued there, growing, feeding on my silence, feeding on my doubts, feeding on the fear I had of discovering the truth. Because deep down, my dear, I was afraid. I was very afraid of what could be in that room, of what my husband could be hiding from me, of the secret he guarded with such devotion. And I was right to be afraid, because when I finally discovered it, nothing was ever the same. The first months of marriage were about adaptation. I was learning to be the lady of that big house, learning my husband's customs, learning to live far from my family. Everything was very new to me. I had left a cramped little house where I lived with my parents and 6 siblings. And now I was in a mansion with 5 bedrooms, where only the 2 of us lived. The silence was different. The loneliness was different. Everything was different. Theodore left early to work in the fields and only returned when the sun was already setting. I spent the whole day alone in that enormous house. I cooked, cleaned, washed clothes in the wash tub, took care of the vegetable garden, fed the chickens. There was a lady named Mrs. Gertrude who came 3 times a week to help me with the heavier chores, but other than that it was just me and that house, me and that silence, me and that locked door at the end of the hallway. In the early days, I tried not to think about that room. I kept myself busy with chores. I sang while I worked. I prayed the rosary every afternoon to distract my mind, but it was impossible to ignore completely. Every time I passed through the hallway, my eyes would land on that door. It was as if it called to me, as if it wanted to tell me something, as if it held a secret that was desperate to come out. The door was dark wood, like the other doors in the house, but there was something different about it. Maybe it was the reinforced lock. Maybe it was the fact that it had never been opened in my presence. Maybe it was just my imagination, fed by curiosity and fear. But that door seemed different, seemed heavier, seemed to carry a weight that the others didn't carry. I remember once, it must have been about 3 months after the wedding, when I was cleaning the hallway and stopped in front of that door. I stood there, looking, as if I expected it to open by itself. And then I did something I had never done before. I touched my hand to the doorknob. The metal was cold, too cold for a hot summer day. I felt a chill go up my arm and take over my whole body. My heart raced, my breathing became heavy, and for a moment, just for a moment, I thought about turning that doorknob, forcing that door, discovering what was on the other side. But then I heard the sound of Theodore's car arriving, and I pulled my hand away so fast I almost tripped backward. I ran to the other side of the house with my heart still racing, my hands still trembling. When my husband came in, I was in the kitchen pretending to stir an empty pot. He looked at me strangely, but said nothing. He never said anything. After that day, I avoided getting close to that door. I passed through the hallway, always hurried, always with my eyes on the floor, as if I was afraid that the door would notice my curiosity. It sounds crazy, I know, but that's how I felt, as if that room knew my thoughts, as if it was watching me. Time went by, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, and I got used to married life. I got used to Theodore's quiet ways, to the long silences during meals, to the nights when he slept with his back to me without saying a word. I learned to live with little affection, with little demonstration of love, because that's how he was, and I had to accept it. But there was one thing I never got used to. One thing that disturbed me more and more as the years passed. It was the nights when Theodore would get up from bed and leave the room. It happened once or twice a month, always in the early morning hours when he thought I was sleeping. I would feel the mattress move when he got up. I'd hear his footsteps on the wooden floor, slow, careful, trying not to make noise. And then I'd hear our bedroom door open and close, very quietly. The first time this happened, I was terrified. I thought there was a burglar in the house and Theodore had gone to check. I lay in bed with my heart in my mouth, waiting for him to return. And he came back about 20 minutes later, lay down beside me, sighed deeply, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I asked if anything had happened during the night. He looked at me confused and said no, that he had slept all night. I found it strange, but didn't insist. I thought maybe I had dreamed it, but it wasn't a dream, because it happened again and again and again. And then I started paying attention. I started pretending I was asleep when I felt him get up. I controlled my breathing to seem heavy and regular. I stayed motionless, with my eyes closed while he left the room. And then very slowly, I would open my eyes and listen. His footsteps went down the hallway, always in the same direction, always to the same place. And then I'd hear the sound of a key turning in a lock and a door opening and footsteps entering a room, and the door closing again. It was the 5th room. My husband got up in the early morning hours to enter that locked room and stayed there for 20, 30 minutes, sometimes up to an hour, alone, in the dark, while I pretended to sleep on the other side of the house. What was he doing in there? What was in that place that he needed to visit in the middle of the night, hidden from his own wife? I started creating theories in my head, each one worse than the other. The first thing I thought was money, that maybe he kept money in there, a hidden fortune that he didn't want anyone to know about. But that didn't make sense. Why visit money in the early morning hours? Why stay in there for so long? Then I thought about stolen goods, that maybe Theodore had some past I didn't know about, that maybe he kept objects that weren't his, but that didn't make sense either. My husband was a hard-working, honest man, respected in the region. Everyone spoke well of him. It didn't match the idea of a criminal. And then came the thought that tormented me most, the thought I tried to push away, but that always came back stronger, more insistent. What if it was another woman? I know it sounds crazy. How could there be another woman inside a locked room? But the mind works in strange ways when it's afraid, when it's insecure. I started imagining that maybe he had a lover, that maybe she entered secretly through the room's window during the night, that maybe the two of them met there while I slept on the other side of the wall. It was an absurd idea. I knew it was absurd, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. And the more I thought about it, the angrier and more jealous and more hurt I became. There was one night, it must have been 1965, 3 years after the wedding, when I decided to follow Theodore. When he got up from bed, I waited a few minutes and got up too. With my heart beating hard, I went to our bedroom door and opened a tiny crack, just enough to see the hallway, and I saw my husband standing in front of that door, the door of the 5th room. He was with his back to me, with his shoulders curved, with his head down. And he was standing there, just standing, without moving. It seemed like he was gathering courage to enter, or maybe asking permission, or maybe praying. I don't know. After what seemed like forever, he put the key in the lock and opened the door. And before entering, he lit a candle that was in a candlestick outside. The light flickered in the hallway, making shadows dance on the walls. And he entered the room and closed the door behind him. I stayed there peeking through the crack, waiting. I don't know how much time passed, maybe 15 minutes, maybe half an hour. Time seems different when you're afraid. It seems to drag, to last longer than it should. And then I heard something that made me freeze. Crying. It was low, muffled crying that came from inside that room. A man's crying, crying of pain, of longing, of despair. It was Theodore crying. My husband, that hard, quiet man who never showed any emotion, was crying alone in the dark inside a locked room in the middle of the night. I can't explain what I felt at that moment. It was a mixture of relief and anguish. Relief because it wasn't another woman. Anguish because I didn't understand what was happening. What was in that room that made my husband cry like that? What pain was that he carried hidden, that he couldn't share even with his own wife? I went back to our room before he came out of there. I lay in bed, pulled the sheet up to my chin, and stayed looking at the ceiling without being able to sleep. When he came back and lay beside me, I pretended I was sleeping, and he sighed that heavy sigh as always and fell asleep. The next morning, I looked at him at the breakfast table and tried to find some sign of what had happened during the night, but he was the same as always. The closed face, the tired eyes, the expression of someone who carries a weight that can't be shared. He ate in silence, took his hat, and left for work as if nothing had happened, as if the night before was just another ordinary night. And I stayed there alone again, with more questions than answers. The years went by, and the routine was established. 1966, 67, 68. Life followed its normal course on the farm. The cattle grew, the crops prospered, the house remained standing, and I continued being Theodore's wife. The woman who took care of the house, who made the food, who washed the clothes. The woman who slept every night next to a man who kept a secret. During all this time, we couldn't have children. I really wanted to be a mother. It was my biggest dream. Every time I saw a child in town, my heart would tighten. Every time an acquaintance announced she was pregnant, I felt an envy that shamed me. But the children didn't come. Month after month, year after year, nothing. Theodore never brought up the subject, never asked why we didn't have children, never suggested we see a doctor, never showed sadness or disappointment. It was as if he didn't care, as if the idea of having children made no difference to him. This hurt me. It hurt me a lot because I thought he didn't want to have a family with me, that he had married just to have someone to take care of his house, that I was more of a maid than a wife. I tried to talk to him once. It was on a Sunday afternoon. We were sitting on the porch watching the sunset. I gathered courage and said, "Theodore, don't you want to have children?" He was silent for a long time, so long that I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he said in a low, hoarse voice, "I already had some, Grace. I already had some." I felt my blood freeze. What did he mean by that? He had children? Where were they? Why had I never known? I opened my mouth to ask, but he got up and went into the house, leaving me alone on the porch. And I stayed there, with my heart racing, with 1,000 questions in my head, understanding nothing. I already had some. Those 3 words kept hammering in my mind for days, weeks, months. What had happened? His first wife had children. Where were these children? Why had no one ever mentioned this? I tried to investigate. When I went to town to shop, I tried to start conversations with older people, those who might know something about Theodore's past. But nobody talked. People would look away, change the subject, pretend they hadn't heard my question. It was as if there was a silent agreement not to talk about it, to keep buried whatever had happened. And I became more and more obsessed, more and more consumed by that mystery. I thought about it in the morning, in the afternoon, at night. I thought when I was cooking, when I was washing clothes, when I was praying. I thought when I was lying in bed, listening to my husband's footsteps going to the 5th room, listening to the muffled crying that came from there. There was a time when I thought about leaving, about going back to my parents' house, about asking for an annulment of the marriage, about starting my life over away from that house, from that man, from that secret. But I didn't have the courage. A separated woman in those days was looked down upon, was rejected, was cause for shame. I was going to shame my whole family, become the subject of town gossip, spend the rest of my life hearing whispers behind my back. So I stayed. I stayed because I had no choice. I stayed because it was my duty. I stayed because, despite everything, I still had hope that one day I would understand, that one day I would discover, that one day I would finally know what was in that room that my husband protected so carefully. And life went on. 1970 arrived. I was already 27 years old, already a grown woman, already had almost 8 years of marriage, and nothing had changed. Theodore continued to be the same quiet, reserved, mysterious man. And that door continued closed, always closed. But there was one thing that was different. Gradually, very slowly, I began to notice that Theodore was changing. Not in personality, no, but in health. He was aging too fast. He was getting thinner, more tired, more hunched over. The hair that was black when we married was already all gray. The hands that were firm already trembled a little. The step that was strong was already more dragged. I started to worry. I insisted for him to go to the doctor, but he refused. He said it was just tiredness, that it was age, that it was nothing serious. And I accepted because I had no way to force him. Husbands were like that. They decided things alone. They didn't listen to women's advice. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just tiredness. I knew there was something wrong, something that was consuming him from the inside slowly, like a fire that burns slow but never goes out. It was the weight of that secret. It was the pain he carried alone. It was that locked room that kept something so heavy it was dragging my husband along. And I kept watching without being able to do anything, without being able to help, without being able to understand, until the day when everything changed, until the day when the door finally opened. The 1970s came bringing changes I didn't expect. The world outside was transforming. I heard on the radio about things that seemed from another planet. Man on the moon, distant wars, protests, new music, different customs. But inside that farm, inside that house with 5 bedrooms, time seemed to have stopped. It was as if we lived in a bubble, separated from the rest of the world, trapped in a routine that repeated day after day, month after month, year after year. I had already learned to live with the mystery. I had already learned to pass through that hallway without looking at the locked door. I had already learned to pretend I didn't hear my husband's footsteps in the early morning hours, that I didn't hear the muffled crying that came from that room. I had built a wall inside me, a wall that separated curiosity from acceptance. and I lived on the side of acceptance. It was easier that way. It was less painful. But what I couldn't ignore was the change in Theodore. My husband was wasting away in front of me. It wasn't something sudden. It wasn't a disease that knocked him down all at once. It was a slow, gradual process, like a candle that burns until there's nothing left. Every day he seemed a little more tired than the previous one. Every week he seemed a little thinner. Every month he seemed to have aged an entire year. In 1972, he started having severe headaches, pains that made him press his temples with his hands, close his eyes tightly, breathe deeply, trying to endure. I begged him to go to the doctor, but he refused. He said it was something temporary, that it would get better by itself, that men don't go running to doctors because of headaches. I got so angry when he talked like that. So angry at this stubbornness, this arrogance of thinking he could solve everything alone, but I couldn't do anything. I was just the wife. The wife's opinion had no weight in the husband's decisions. That's how it worked. That's how it had to be. In 73, in addition to the headaches, came dizziness. Theodore was working in the fields when suddenly the world spun and he fell to the ground. The employees brought him to the house carried. I almost died of fright when I saw my husband being brought in the arms of two men, pale as wax, with his eyes rolled back. This time I didn't ask. I sent one of the employees to town to get Dr. Patterson, the only doctor in the region. Theodore tried to protest, tried to say he didn't need it, but I didn't let him. For the first time in more than 10 years of marriage, I disobeyed my husband, and I don't regret it. Dr. Patterson was an old man with a white beard and thick glasses who had been treating the entire region for decades. He examined Theodore carefully, measured his blood pressure, listened to his heart, asked questions about the symptoms, and then called me to a corner of the room, away from my husband's ears. "Mrs. Grace," he said quietly, "your husband has very high blood pressure, dangerously high. If he doesn't take care of himself, doesn't change his habits, doesn't take the medicine, this can end very badly." "Very badly how, doctor?" I asked, already feeling fear tighten my chest. "He could have a stroke, Mrs. Grace, and if that happens, the consequences can be serious, very serious." I felt my legs weaken. I had to lean against the wall to not fall. Stroke. I knew that word. I knew what it meant. I had seen people in town who had had strokes. Some were left with crooked faces, some lost movement on one side of the body, some were bedridden forever, some died. The doctor prescribed some medicines and recommended rest. He told Theodore to stop working so hard, eat less salt, avoid worries. My husband listened to everything in silence, with that closed expression as always. When the doctor left, he got up from bed and said he was going back to work. I begged. I begged on my knees, with tears in my eyes, for him to rest, to take care of himself, to think about his own health. But he didn't listen. He said he had obligations, that the farm couldn't stop, that he wasn't going to lie down while there was work to do. And he left, leaving me there crying alone in the room. That day I realized something. Theodore wasn't just ignoring his own health. He was destroying himself on purpose. It was as if he didn't want to take care of himself, as if he didn't care about living, as if that pain he carried inside was so great that death seemed like a relief. And this realization hurt me more than anything else, because I understood that my husband was suffering in a way that I couldn't reach, in a way that I couldn't help. He was drowning right in front of me, and I couldn't do anything but watch. The following years were difficult. 74, 75, 76. I watched my husband fade away slowly, like a lamp running out of kerosene. He still worked, still took care of the farm, still did everything he always did, but with less strength, less will, less life. The nightly visits to the fifth room became more frequent. Before it was once or twice a month, now it was almost every week, sometimes 2, 3 times in the same week. And the crying also became longer, more intense, more desperate. I would lie in bed, pretending to sleep, listening to my husband sob on the other side of the wall. And I cried too. I cried silently, wetting the pillow, without understanding, without being able to do anything. I thought many times about confronting him, about demanding answers, about saying that I couldn't stand living like that anymore, in the dark, without knowing what was happening. But every time I gathered courage, I looked at him and saw a man so broken, so fragile, so close to completely falling apart that I gave up. I was afraid that a confrontation would be the last straw, that it would push him definitely into the abyss. So I continued in silence. I continued being the patient, understanding wife who didn't ask, who didn't question, who didn't demand. I continued waiting for him to open up one day, for him to trust me one day, for him to tell me one day what was hidden in that room. But the day that came wasn't like I expected. It wasn't a calm conversation on the porch. It wasn't a confession in the middle of the night. It was a tragedy. It was March 1977. Summer was ending, but the heat was still punishing. It was an unbearable mugginess, the kind that leaves your clothes stuck to your body and your head heavy. Theodore had left early to solve some things in town. I stayed home doing my usual tasks. Around 3 in the afternoon, I heard the sound of a car arriving. I found it strange because Theodore had said he would only return at night. I went to the window and saw it wasn't his car. It was Mr. Adams' truck, a neighbor who had land on the other side of the river. Mr. Adams got out of the car with an expression I'll never forget, an expression of someone who's about to give terrible news. He took off his hat, looked at the ground, and said, "Mrs. Grace, you need to come with me. Your Theodore took ill in town. He's at Dr. Patterson's office. It looks serious." I don't remember exactly what happened next. I know I got in the truck. I know we went to town. I know I prayed the whole way, repeating Hail Mary after Hail Mary, asking God not to take my husband yet. Not now. Not like this. When I arrived at the office, I found Theodore lying on a stretcher with the right side of his body paralyzed. His face was crooked, one side drooping, without movement. His eyes were open, but they seemed lost, confused, as if he didn't understand where he was. Dr. Patterson came to talk to me, said it was what he feared, a stroke. The pressure had gone too high, and something had burst inside his head. He said Theodore needed intensive care, but that in our town there was no hospital. The closest one was a 3-hour trip away, and he didn't know if my husband could withstand the journey. I felt the ground disappear from under my feet. It was as if the world had lost gravity, and I was floating without knowing where to go, without knowing what to do. My husband was dying. The man I had lived with for 15 years, the man I had learned to love despite everything, despite the silence, despite the secrets, was dying. We tried the journey. Mr. Adams drove as fast as he could while I was in the back seat, holding Theodore's hand, the left hand, the one that still had movement. I squeezed that hand and talked to him, even without knowing if he could hear me. I said everything would be fine, that he would recover, that we would go back home and continue our life together. But I knew it was a lie. I saw in his face that it was a lie. When we were almost reaching the hospital in the big city, Theodore squeezed my hand. It was a weak, trembling squeeze, but it was a squeeze. I looked at him and saw he was trying to speak. His mouth was moving, but the sound wasn't coming out right. It was a dragged moan, hard to understand. I got closer, put my ear near his mouth, and heard in a whisper that seemed to come from far away, a word that made me freeze. Room. I pulled my face away and looked into his eyes. Those dark eyes that had always been so mysterious, so closed, were now full of tears, full of fear, full of a pain I had never seen before. He tried to speak again, his mouth moving slowly, each syllable costing enormous effort, and I heard more broken words, but that I managed to put together, "The room. Forgive me, Grace, forgive me." And then his eyes rolled back and he fainted. I screamed. I screamed for Mr. Adams to drive faster. I screamed for Theodore not to give up. I screamed for God not to take him yet. And we reached the hospital, and the doctors came running and took him inside, and I stayed there in the hallway alone, trembling, praying, crying. Those were the longest hours of my life. I stayed in that hospital hallway, sitting in a hard plastic chair, looking at the white wall, waiting for news. Every time a door opened, my heart raced. Every time someone in a white coat passed by, I would stand up, hoping they would come talk to me. But nobody came, and time passed, and the anguish only increased. Finally, when it was already late at night, a doctor came looking for me. He said Theodore had survived, but that the stroke had been severe, very severe. He would need months of recovery, maybe years. And even so, he probably would never be like he was before. The right side of his body could be compromised forever. Speech might not return completely. Memory could fail. I thanked the doctor, thanked that my husband was alive. That's all that mattered at that moment. He was alive. He still had a chance. Theodore stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. I spent that whole time at the hospital sleeping in a chair beside his bed, only leaving to eat something quick and come back running. I wanted to be there when he woke up. I wanted to be the first thing he saw. And when he finally opened his eyes, days after the stroke, the first thing he did was look at me. And the first thing he tried to say with that crooked mouth that could barely form words was again the same thing. The room. Forgive me. I held his hand and said everything was fine, that we would solve everything, that he didn't need to worry. But inside, I was consumed by curiosity. What was in that room that was so important? What did he need to ask my forgiveness for so much? After 2 weeks, the doctors released Theodore to return home. He was still very weak, could barely walk alone, needed help with everything. I hired a girl from town called Emma to help me take care of him, because I wouldn't be able to handle it alone. The trip back was silent. Theodore went the whole way with his eyes closed, his head leaning against the car window. I kept looking at him, trying to understand what was going through that mind, behind those closed eyes. Was he thinking about the room? Was he sorry he never told me before? When we arrived at the farm, I helped him enter the house, and for the first time in 15 years, I saw Theodore look at that door at the end of the hallway in a different way. It was no longer the protective look as always, it was a look of farewell, as if he knew he would never be able to enter there again, as if he was saying goodbye. That night, after settling Theodore in bed, I went to the bedroom where we had stored his clothes from the hospital. And there, in the pocket of the pants he was wearing on the day of the stroke, I found the key to the 5th room. I held that key in my hand for a long time. It was cold, heavy, old. The metal was worn from being touched so much, from being carried so much, from being hidden so much. That key had been my husband's best-kept secret for decades, and now it was in my hand. I could open the door. Finally, after 15 years, I could discover what was inside. But I hesitated. I looked back at the bedroom door, where Theodore was sleeping a restless sleep from medicines. He had asked for my forgiveness. He had tried to tell me something about that room, but hadn't been able to. Did I have the right to discover without his permission? Should I wait for him to get better and be able to tell me? What if he didn't get better? What if I never knew the truth? I stayed awake all night, with that key clutched in my hand, thinking, praying, deciding. And when the sun began to rise, painting the sky orange and pink, I made my decision. I was going to open that door. I was going to discover my husband's secret. I was finally going to enter the 5th room. But what I found inside, my dear, changed everything I thought I knew about the man I had married. I waited for the day to brighten completely before getting up from that chair where I had spent the night awake. The key was still in my hand, so tight it had left a mark on my palm. I looked at it again, studying every detail of that piece of iron that had kept so many secrets for so many years. It was an old key, one of those with an ornate handle, with designs worn by time and use. How many times had Theodore held that same key? How many times had he turned it in that lock? How many nights had he crossed that hallway alone, carrying that key as if he carried the weight of the world? I got up slowly. My legs were numb from sitting so long. I went to the bedroom where Theodore was sleeping and opened the door very quietly, just to see if he was okay. He was there, lying on his back, with heavy and irregular breathing from someone under the effect of strong medicine. His face was still crooked, the right side drooping, without expression. But he was alive, he was breathing. That's what mattered. I closed the door again and stood in the hallway. The house was in absolute silence. Emma, the girl I had hired to help, only arrived later. I was alone. Alone with that key. Alone with that door. Alone with the decision I had made. My feet started walking before I even commanded them. It was as if they had a will of their own, as if they knew the way by heart, as if they had waited 15 years for this moment. I walked down the hallway slowly, feeling each wooden board creak under my weight. The morning sun came through the windows and made streaks of light on the floor. Dust floated in the air, shining like golden glitter. It was a beautiful day outside, a day that didn't match the weight I felt in my chest. When I reached the front of the door, I stopped. I stood there looking at it, as I had done so many times over those years. But this time was different. This time, I had the key. This time, I was going in. I raised my hand and touched my fingers to the wood. It was cold, cold as it had been that day, so many years ago, when I had touched the doorknob for the first time. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, trying to control my heart that was beating uncontrollably in my chest. What would I find on the other side? What had Theodore hidden from me for so long? I put the key in the lock. Metal scraped against metal, a sound that echoed through the empty hallway. I turned the key slowly, feeling the resistance of the old lock that hadn't been used in a while. There was a click. The lock gave way. The door was unlocked. I put my hand on the doorknob. I was trembling so much I could barely hold it. I breathed deeply once more. I asked God for strength and pushed the door. It opened with a long, dragged creak, like a moan of pain. A musty smell invaded my nostrils. The smell of dust, of mold, of stopped time. The smell of a place that had been closed for years, decades, without fresh air, without sunlight, without life. At first, I couldn't see anything. The room was dark, the curtains closed, blocking any light. I stood at the door, waiting for my eyes to get used to the darkness. And gradually, very slowly, the shapes began to appear. The furniture outlines began to reveal themselves, and what I saw took my breath away. It was a child's room. I blinked, thinking I was seeing wrong, but I wasn't. It was a child's room, a small, cozy room, decorated with all the care and love that a mother and father can have. The walls were painted a light yellow, faded by time, but still visible. There were hand-painted drawings near the ceiling, drawings of little birds, of flowers, of butterflies. Drawings made with love, made to brighten a child's eyes. I took a step inside. My feet raised a cloud of dust from the floor. The wooden floor creaked loudly, protesting against the invasion after so many years of silence. I walked slowly, looking around, trying to absorb every detail of that place. In the center of the room was a crib, a dark wood crib, ornately carved, with delicate railings and a lace veil hanging over it. The veil was yellowed, covered with dust, torn in some places, but you could see that it had once been white, immaculate, bought with pride to welcome a baby. I approached the crib and looked inside. There was a little mattress covered by a faded flannel sheet, and on top of the sheet was a doll, a rag doll with black yarn hair and a flowered calico dress. The doll was lying there, as if waiting for its owner to come back and play with it. I felt my legs weaken. I had to lean on the crib's edge to not fall. A child. Theodore had had a child. A child who had slept in this crib, who had played with this doll, who had filled this room with laughter and life. A child I never knew. A child about whom no one ever spoke. I looked around, looking for more clues, more answers. Next to the crib was a small wardrobe, the right size for children's clothes. I opened the doors and found dresses, little dresses of simple fabric, handmade. There was a white baptism dress, A flowered Sunday dress. Everyday cotton dresses, all hanging on wooden hangers, covered with dust, but preserved with care. Under the dresses, on the lower shelves, there were shoes. Little leather shoes, so small they fit in the palm of my hand. There were folded socks, hair ribbons, satin bows, everything organized, everything kept, as if the owner was going to return at any moment to use them. I closed the wardrobe and turned to the rest of the room. In one corner was a small rocking chair, child-sized, with an embroidered cushion on the seat. Next to the chair was a low table, and on top of the table were toys, a stack of wooden blocks, a little rocking horse, a set of tin pots, simple toys, from a simple time, but that told a story of love and care. The walls had pictures, small pictures, with wooden frames that I hadn't noticed in the dark. I approached one of them and cleaned the dust with my blouse sleeve. And when I saw what it was, my heart stopped. It was a photograph, an old photograph, in black and white, of a little girl. She must have been about 2 or 3 years old in the photo. She had dark, curly hair, tied with a light ribbon, big, round eyes that looked straight at the camera with an expression of curiosity. Chubby cheeks, small nose, heart-shaped mouth. She was a beautiful girl, a girl who seemed full of life, full of joy, full of future. I took the picture off the wall and held it with both hands. I kept looking at that little face for a long time, trying to find similarities, trying to understand. And I found them. I found them in the eyes. Those big, dark eyes were exactly like Theodore's. Exactly the same. It was his daughter. I put the picture back and went looking for more photos, and I found them. There were several scattered around the room. Photos of the baby girl sleeping in the crib. Photos of the girl crawling on the floor. Photos of the girl taking her first steps, holding someone's hand outside the frame. Photos of the girl smiling, showing her first little teeth. Photos of the girl in the arms of a woman. The woman, Theodore's first wife, Catherine. I had never seen a photo of her. No one had ever shown me. But there in that room was a large photo of her with the daughter in her arms. Catherine was a beautiful woman with a gentle face and sweet look. She had her hair pulled back in a low bun and wore a simple dress with a closed collar. She looked at the camera with a small, almost shy smile, and the girl in her arms looked at her mother with an adoration that crossed time, that crossed the photograph, that reached me decades later. I began to cry without realizing, without wanting. Tears began to flow down my face and fall on the dusty floor. I cried for that girl I never knew. I cried for that mother who died too young. I cried for my husband who had carried this pain alone for so many years. I cried for myself, who had lived in ignorance, who had suspected the wrong things, who had spent years thinking the worst. I went to the window and opened the curtain. Sunlight came in all at once, illuminating the entire room, revealing every corner, every detail that the darkness had hidden. And that's when I saw the nightstand beside the crib, and on top of the nightstand, an envelope. I approached slowly, as if I was afraid the envelope would disappear if I walked too fast. I picked it up carefully. It was an old envelope, thick paper, yellowed by time. It wasn't sealed. The flap was just folded inward, as if it had been opened and closed many times over the years. I opened the envelope and took out what was inside. It was a letter, a handwritten letter in feminine handwriting, careful, in ink that was already fading. And at the top of the letter, a name, Catherine. I had to sit on the floor to be able to read. My legs couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking so much the paper was rattling. But I read every word of that letter, and each word was like a knife going into my heart. The letter said, "My dear Theodore, if you are reading this, it's because I couldn't make it. I tried, my love. I tried with all my strength, but my body couldn't take it, and now I have to go. I know you're going to be angry. I know you're going to be sad. I know you're going to want to come with me, but I ask, my love, I beg you, don't do that. Stay. Stay for our Rebecca. She needs you. She needs a father. She needs someone to take care of her, to protect her, to love her as I love her. I wanted to have more time. I wanted to see our daughter grow up. I wanted to see her take her first steps, say her first words, go to school, get married, have her own children. I wanted to grow old by your side, Theodore. I wanted to spend the rest of my life waking up every morning and seeing your face. But God wanted differently, and I have to accept. Take care of our little girl, my love. Tell her that Mommy loved her more than life itself. Tell her that I'll be watching from above every day, taking care of her from afar. Tell her that I'll never forget her, never, not in eternity. And you, Theodore, my husband, my companion, my love, I want you to be happy. I know it will be difficult at first, but with time I want you to find someone to take care of you, to take care of Rebecca, to bring joy back to this house. Don't close yourself to the world because of me. Don't condemn yourself to a life of sadness. Live, my love. Live for me. Live for us. I will always love you. From wherever I am, I will always love you. With all my heart, forever, your Catherine. I couldn't finish reading without sobbing. Tears fell on the paper, and I had to pull the letter away to not smear the ink. It was the letter of a woman who knew she was going to die. A farewell letter. A love letter that crossed decades and reached me. The second wife, the woman who came after, the woman who never knew anything. Catherine had died in childbirth. I understood that from the letter. She must have written it while she was pregnant, preparing for the worst, hoping for the best. But the worst happened, and she was gone, and left Theodore alone with a baby daughter to raise. But the girl in the photos wasn't a baby. There were photos of her older, walking, playing, smiling. What had happened? Why was that room intact, as if the child was going to return at any moment? I got up from the floor and looked for more clues. I opened the dresser drawers and found more clothes, more personal objects. And at the bottom of one of the drawers, I found another envelope. This one was smaller, simpler, and inside was an official paper, a paper with a stamp, with signatures, with printed letters. It was a death certificate. Name, Rebecca Catherine Miller. Date of birth, August 15th, 1954. Date of death, March 3rd, 1958. Cause of death, typhoid fever. Age, 3 years and 6 months. I dropped the paper on the floor. I couldn't hold it. My hands lost strength. My body lost support. My soul lost direction. The girl had died. Theodore's daughter had died at 3.5 years old, from fever, from a disease that nowadays has a cure. But that back then in the countryside, without resources, without hospital, killed children every day. Theodore had lost his wife in childbirth, and less than 4 years later had lost his daughter too. He had been left alone in the world, with no one, just with this house that was too big, with this room full of memories, with this pain too big to fit in just one body. And he had locked everything up. He had locked the room, locked the pain, locked the memories. He had kept the key in his pocket and had gone on, because it was what he needed to do, because it was the only option he had. He had found another woman, had married again, had tried to rebuild a life, but had never been able to talk about it. He had never been able to share this pain, had never been able to open this door to anyone else, until now. I stayed in that room for hours, sitting on the floor, surrounded by Rebecca's things, crying a grief that wasn't mine, but that now was also mine. I cried for the girl I never knew, for the mother who died too young, for my husband who suffered in silence for decades. I cried for all the years I spent suspecting, distrusting, thinking horrible things. I cried from shame. I cried from regret. I cried from a pain that has no name. When I finally managed to get up, the sun was already high in the sky. It must have been almost noon. I heard noises in the house and realized that Emma had arrived. She must have been looking for me, wondering where I had gone. I cleaned my face with the back of my hands, trying to hide the tears, but it was impossible. My eyes were swollen, my nose was red, my blouse was all stained. Anyone who looked at me would know I had been crying. I left the room and closed the door behind me, but didn't lock it. Never again would that door be locked. Never again would that secret be hidden. Emma found me in the hallway and widened her eyes when she saw me. She asked what had happened, if I was okay, if I needed anything. I said I was fine, that it was just tiredness, that it had been a difficult night. She didn't believe it. I could see by her expression, but she didn't insist. She was a discreet woman who knew her place. I went to the bedroom where Theodore was. He had woken up. He was lying with his eyes open, looking at the ceiling, lost in thoughts that I now began to understand. When I entered, he slowly turned his head and looked at me. And he saw. He saw in my eyes that I knew. He saw in my tears that I had discovered. He saw in my expression that the door had finally been opened. His eyes filled with tears. Those eyes that I had seen cry so many times from afar, hidden in the dark, now cried in front of me, without shame, without disguise. His body began to tremble. His crooked mouth tried to form words, but only sobs came out. I went to him, sat on the edge of the bed, took his hand, the left hand, the one that still had movement, and squeezed it tightly. I saw the room, Theodore, I said. I saw Rebecca. And he cried. He cried like I had never seen a man cry. He cried like a child, without control, without shame. He cried years and years of repressed pain, of unlived grief, of kept suffering. He cried for the wife he lost, the daughter he buried, the life he didn't have. And I stayed there holding his hand, crying together, sharing that pain that for so long he had carried alone. At that moment, my dear, I understood something very important. I understood that Theodore's secret wasn't a secret of evil, it wasn't betrayal, it wasn't crime, it wasn't anything I had imagined. It was a secret of pain, a pain so great, so deep, so devastating that he didn't know how to talk about it, didn't know how to share it, didn't know how to let another person carry it together. And I also understood that my role there wasn't to judge, wasn't to demand, wasn't to ask why he hadn't told me before. My role was to welcome, to forgive, to help him finally do the grieving he had never been able to do. And that's what I did. That day, after Theodore stopped crying, we stayed in silence for a long time. Me sitting on the edge of the bed, holding his hand. Him lying down, looking at the ceiling, with red and swollen eyes. We didn't need words. Sometimes silence says more than any conversation, and that silence said everything. It said that now I knew. It said that now we could start over. It said that that door that had been closed for so long had finally been opened and would never close again. When the sun began to set and the room became orange with the light of late afternoon, Theodore squeezed my hand. It was a weak squeeze, because he was still very weak, but it was a squeeze full of meaning. I looked at him and saw he was trying to speak. His crooked mouth moved slowly, forming words with difficulty, but with determination. I leaned closer, putting my ear near his mouth, as I had done in the car, on the way to the hospital, and this time I could understand what he said. Thank you. Just one word, but a word that carried the weight of 15 years of silence. A word that meant more than 1,000 apologies, more than 1,000 explanations. Thank you for discovering. Thank you for not running away. Thank you for being there holding his hand even after knowing everything. I squeezed his hand back and said he didn't need to thank me. I said I was his wife, that I had promised to stay by his side in joy and sadness, in sickness and health, and that I would keep that promise until the end. The following days were of recovery, not just physical, but emotional too. Theodore was recovering from the stroke slowly, very slowly. Dr. Patterson came every week to examine him, adjust medications, give guidance. He said recovery would be long, that maybe he would never be like he was before, but that with care and patience he could have a dignified life. And while his body was recovering, his soul was too. Because now he was no longer alone with that pain. Now he had someone to share it with. And sharing pain, my dear, is the first step to being able to bear it. We started talking, not all at once, not in long conversations, because he still had difficulty speaking, but in pieces, in fragments, a little each day. He told me about Catherine, about how they met, about how they fell in love, about the simple wedding in the little church of the village where she lived. He told me about the pregnancy, about the joy of knowing he was going to be a father, about the plans they made for the family they were building. And he told me about the day everything collapsed. The birth was difficult. Back then there was no hospital nearby, no doctor available, just the village midwife, an old woman who had already helped bring hundreds of children into the world. But this time, something went wrong. Catherine bled too much. The midwife did everything she could, but it wasn't enough. The girl was born healthy, crying loud, full of life. But the mother was gone before she could even hold the daughter in her arms. Theodore told me this with tears streaming down his face. He said it was the worst day of his life, that he held Catherine's hand while she passed away, that he promised her he would take care of Rebecca, that he would raise their daughter with all the love in the world, and that he tried with all his strength. He raised Rebecca alone in the first years, with help from a neighbor who breastfed the girl along with her own child, with help from the community that brought food and clothes, with help from God who gave him strength to get up every morning. He learned to change diapers, to give baths, to make baby food, to sing lullabies. He learned to be father and mother at the same time, and learned to love that girl more than he loved his own life. Rebecca was a happy child. Theodore told me this with a sad smile on his face. He said she laughed at everything, that she ran through the house making a mess, that she loved playing with the farm animals. He said she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn way. He said she was the light of his life, the reason to continue, the motive for each breath. And then came the fever. It started suddenly on a March night in '58. Rebecca had been fine during the day, playing, eating, laughing, but at night she woke up burning with fever. Theodore spent the whole night making compresses, giving tea, praying. When dawn came, he went running to get the town pharmacist, who was the closest thing to a doctor they had. The man came, examined the girl, and said it was typhoid fever, a serious disease, very serious, that needed medicines he didn't have, treatments that didn't exist there. Theodore mounted his horse and went to the big city to get medicine. It was hours of travel, of desperation, of prayer. When he returned with the medicines in hand, it was too late. The fever had consumed the girl. Rebecca had passed away at 3.5 years old, in the arms of the neighbor who was taking care of her while her father was away. He couldn't say goodbye. When Theodore told me this, he cried so much I thought he wouldn't be able to stop. I held him in my arms like you hold a child and let him cry. Cry everything he had kept for almost 20 years. Cry the guilt of not having been there at the time. Cry the anger of not having been able to save her. Cry the longing that never, at any moment, had diminished. After the burial, he closed the room, locked the door, and kept the key. He told himself he would preserve everything just as it was, that he wouldn't touch anything, that he would keep Rebecca's room intact forever, as if she was going to return, as if she was just traveling and would one day appear at the door, asking to come in, asking to play with the rag doll. He knew it was madness. He knew she wasn't coming back, but it was the only way he found to deal with the pain. It was the only way to keep her close, to not let her memory disappear, to not lose the last piece that remained. And for almost 20 years, he visited that room. He would enter in the early morning hours when he thought no one would see. He would sit in the little rocking chair, hold the rag doll, and talk to his daughter. He would tell her how the day had been, what had happened on the farm, what the weather was like. He would tell her he missed her, tell her he loved her, tell her that one day they would meet again. And he cried all the tears he couldn't cry during the day. He cried the pain he couldn't show to anyone. He cried alone, in the dark, embraced in the memories of a girl the world had taken too early. When he finished telling me all this, it was already night. The house was dark, only lit by the oil lamp on the nightstand. I was exhausted from so much crying, so much emotion, so much revelation. But I was also relieved to finally understand, to finally know the man I had married, to finally know the truth. I looked at Theodore and saw that he was also relieved. There was a peace in his face that I had never seen before, the peace of someone who finally shared a weight he had carried alone, the peace of someone who was finally heard, was understood, was accepted. That night, I slept beside him, holding his hand. And for the first time in 15 years of marriage, I felt that we were truly together, not just sharing a house, a bed, a life, but sharing our souls, sharing pain, sharing everything. The weeks went by, and Theodore improved slowly. He never fully recovered the movement on his right side. His leg was left dragging, his arm was left weak, his face was left a little crooked, but his speech came back almost completely. And with speech came more stories, more memories, more pieces of a past he had kept locked for so long. He told me about the day Rebecca learned to walk, about the first word she said, which was Daddy, about her second birthday when he made a crooked cake and she got all covered in frosting, about the nights when she couldn't sleep and he would sing until she closed her eyes, about the way she would run to hug him when he came home from work. Each story was a piece of his heart that he was giving me, and I received each piece with care, with affection, with respect, because I knew it wasn't easy for him. I knew each memory came accompanied by pain, but I also knew that talking was important, that speaking was part of the healing, that sharing was the path to moving forward. About 2 months after the stroke, when Theodore was already able to get out of bed and walk a little around the house with the help of a cane, he asked me for something. He asked me to take him to the 5th room. I hesitated. I asked if he was sure, if he was ready, if it wouldn't be too painful. He said he needed to, that he needed to enter there again, but this time during the day, this time with me, this time without hiding. I helped him walk down the hallway slowly, one step at a time. When we reached the door, he stopped and stared for a moment. The door was ajar, not locked, as I had left it since the day I entered. He breathed deeply, extended his hand, and pushed. The sunlight came through the window I had left open. The room was no longer dark and humid as before. It was illuminated, airy, alive. Dust still covered everything, but now you could see every detail clearly. The crib, the wardrobe, the toys, the photos, everything bathed in the golden light of the afternoon. Theodore entered the room and walked slowly, looking around, as if he was seeing everything for the first time. Or maybe he was seeing it in a new way, without the guilt, without the weight, without the secret, just with longing, just with love, just with the memory of a daughter he would never forget. He went to the crib and picked up the rag doll. He held it against his chest, closed his eyes and stayed silent for a while. I stood at the door, giving space, respecting the moment. And when he opened his eyes again, I saw he was crying. But it was a different cry. It wasn't the desperate cry from before. It was a cry of farewell, a cry of acceptance, a cry of someone who was finally managing to let go. He turned to me and said with a voice that was choked but firm, "Grace, I want to transform this room." I asked what he meant. He explained. He said he didn't want this room to be a place of pain anymore, a place of secrets, a locked place. He said he wanted to transform it into a place of memory, of tribute, of love. A place where we could remember Rebecca and Catherine with affection, not with suffering. A place of light, not darkness. I agreed with all my heart. In the following weeks, we worked together on that transformation. I cleaned everything carefully, removed the dust, washed the curtains, scrubbed the floor. Theodore guided me, even without being able to help much because of the body's limitations. We organized Rebecca's clothes in a beautiful box, lined with fabric that was kept in the wardrobe. We put the photos in new frames and arranged them on a shelf, like an altar of memories. In the center of the room, where the crib was, we placed a small table with a white lace tablecloth. On top of the table, we put an image of Our Lady, a vase with flowers from the garden, and the photos of Catherine and Rebecca side by side. It was an oratory, a sacred place, a place to remember, to pray, to thank for the lives of those two people who had been so important. When we finished, Theodore stood at the door, looking at the transformed room, and he smiled. For the first time since I had known him, I saw a real smile on his face. A smile that reached his eyes, that lit up his expression, that warmed the heart of anyone who saw it. He said Catherine would like it, that Rebecca would like it, that now they had a beautiful place to live in his memory. No longer a dark and locked room, but a room of light and love. From that day on, we visited the room together. Every afternoon after lunch, we would go there, light a candle, say a Our Father and a Hail Mary, and stay silent for a few minutes. Sometimes, Theodore would tell another story, another memory that had returned. Sometimes we would just stay there holding hands, looking at the photos, feeling the presence of those two souls that we knew were nearby. The years went by, 78, 79, 80. Theodore never fully recovered from the stroke, but managed to live with dignity. He walked with a cane, spoke with some difficulty, needed help with some things, but he was alive, he was present, he was for the first time in a long time at peace. Our relationship changed after all that. We became closer, more intimate, more connected. He began to talk more, to share more, to show more. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, he never was. But small gestures appeared, a caress on the hand, a lingering look, a whispered thank you before sleeping. Small things that meant the world to me. I learned to love him in a different way. No longer the anxious love of a young bride wanting to please, but the mature love of a woman who knew the man completely. With all the wounds, with all the scars, with all the pains. A love that had gone through fire and had come out stronger. In 1985, 8 years after the stroke, Theodore had a relapse. Another stroke, this one stronger than the first. The doctors said there wasn't much to do, that it was a matter of time. I brought him home. I didn't want him to die in the hospital alone, surrounded by strangers. I wanted him to die in his house, in his bed, with the people who loved him nearby. In the last days, he spent most of the time sleeping, but in the moments when he woke up, he would hold my hand and look at me with those eyes that I had learned to read so well. And I knew what he wanted to say, even without words. I knew he was thanking. I knew he was saying goodbye. I knew he was ready to go. On the last night, I was sitting beside his bed, holding his hand, as always. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and with a voice so weak I almost didn't hear, he said their names. Catherine, Rebecca. And then he said mine. Grace. And he smiled. That smile I had seen for the first time when we transformed the room. The smile of peace, the smile of someone who is ready. I squeezed his hand and said everything was fine, that he could go, that Catherine and Rebecca were waiting for him, that I would be okay, that I would take care of everything. He closed his eyes. His breathing became slower, more spaced, and at a moment I can't pinpoint exactly when, his breathing stopped and he was gone. I stayed there holding his hand for a long time afterward, crying, yes, but not from despair, from gratitude. Gratitude for having had him in my life. Gratitude for discovering the truth. Gratitude for having had the chance to help him heal. Gratitude for having loved and been loved. Even if in a crooked way, even if in a difficult way, even if in a way that took years to complete. After the funeral, I returned home and went to the room we had transformed together. I lit a candle, said a prayer, and placed a photo of Theodore next to the photos of Catherine and Rebecca. Now they were together again, the complete family, united in memory, united in love, united forever. I continued living in that house for many years. I continued visiting that room every afternoon. I continued talking to them, telling how my life was going, asking for protection, thanking for everything. That room, which had once been a place of pain, became the most sacred place in the house, the place where I found peace, the place where I felt I was never alone. Today, I'm 82 years old. I've lived longer than most people of my generation. I've been through a lot. I've seen a lot of change. I've learned a lot of lessons. But the biggest lesson of all, I learned from Theodore. I learned that the pain we keep alone gets bigger, and the pain we share gets smaller. I learned that secrets don't protect anyone. They only hurt. I learned that true love is the one that welcomes the whole person with all the wounds, with all the scars. And I also learned that it's never too late to heal. Theodore spent almost 20 years carrying that pain alone, but in the last 8 years of his life, he managed to do the grieving he had never done. He managed to talk about the wife and daughter he lost. He managed to cry in front of another person without shame. He managed to transform a room of darkness into a room of light. It's never too late, my dear. It's never too late to open the doors we keep locked. If you're watching this video and have some kept pain, some secret that's consuming you, some door you've kept closed for too long, I want to tell you something. Open that door, share that pain, look for someone you trust, and tell what you're carrying. It might be difficult, it might be scary, it might seem impossible, but I promise you that on the other side there's relief. On the other side there's healing. On the other side there's peace. Theodore asked for my forgiveness that day at the hospital. He asked forgiveness for hiding that secret for so many years, but I told him there was nothing to forgive, because I understood that he didn't hide it out of malice. He hid it because he didn't know how to do differently. He hid it because the pain was too great. He hid it because it was the only way he found to survive. And I also understood that sometimes we need help to open the doors we ourselves locked. Theodore might never have been able to open that door alone. He needed the stroke. He needed the body's weakness. He needed to almost die to finally let me in. But he let me in. And when he let me in, everything changed. So if you know someone who's carrying a weight, who's keeping a secret, who's suffering in silence, extend your hand, offer your shoulder, show that you're there, ready to listen, ready to welcome, ready to help carry. Sometimes that's all the person needs. To know they're not alone, to know they have someone by their side, to know the door can be opened without the world collapsing. This is my story, my dear. The story of the fifth room, the story of a secret that lasted 15 years, the story of a pain that lasted decades, but also the story of a healing, the story of a forgiveness, the story of a love that survived everything. I'm Grandma Grace, and I hope my story has touched your hearts. If it did, leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Sometimes a video, a story, a word can change someone's life. It can be the push someone needed to open the door that was locked. It can be the light someone needed to illuminate the dark room. And tell me here in the comments where you're watching from, what city, what state. I read all the comments, okay? And I love knowing that there are people from all over following these grandma stories. May God bless each one of you. May God give strength to those going through difficulties. May God give courage to those who need to open a door. And may God give love, lots of love to all of us. A kiss to your hearts from Grandma Grace with love.